Hello and welcome to Investment Insight. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Now let's break down what's happening in the markets today in a clear and simple way.
Thanks for having me. And there is definitely a lot happening today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, imagine waking up tomorrow to find out that the foundation of your entire economy, everything from your smartphone to your electric grid, relies on a single fraying extension cord.
Right. An extension cord controlled by someone who might just decide to pull the plug at any second.
Exactly. It's a terrifying scenario. But according to recent analysis, that is exactly the reality that the world's largest economies are waking up to right now.
Yeah, it really is. For, well, the last 30 or 40 years, the global economic playbook was just remarkably simple. You build a supply chain that finds the absolute cheapest price for parts and labor, no matter where on the map they come from.
But the data shows that era is completely over.
Completely over. We are witnessing a massive multi-trillion-dollar pivot. Nations are abandoning that cheapest price model to aggressively build what we can only really call bulletproof resilience.
And in this deep dive, we're going to explore exactly how this is playing out. We're looking at two major economic heavyweights, the European Union and Japan.
Right, so first we'll trace how Europe is fundamentally rewiring its global trade to avoid being crushed between the United States and China.
And then we'll look at Japan. We'll see how they're attempting to power the incoming artificial intelligence revolution, which is, a challenge so severe it's forcing them to revive their nuclear power industry.
Overcoming some profound historical trauma to do it, yeah.
So let's start with Europe. The European Union is the third largest economy in the world, right? Representing roughly 14.7% of global GDP.
That's right.
But underneath that massive number lies a very specific, a very dangerous structural vulnerability.
Right, because unlike the US or China, the EU does not have a unified, monolithic domestic market.
Yeah.
And crucially, they completely lack resource independence.
Meaning they have to import almost everything required to build modern technology.
Exactly. And that vulnerability has been brutally exposed over the last couple of years by two major catalysts. The first, honestly, is the United States.
Right, the U.S. factor. Look at what happened in February 2025. President Trump restarted high tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, and, importantly for Europe, pushed steel and aluminum tariffs up to 25%.
Which is a huge deal. For decades, Europe's economic engine worked by manufacturing high-quality industrial goods and exporting them to a predictable, reliable American consumer base.
But those tariffs prove that the U.S. market is no longer a guaranteed safety net for European exports.
Exactly. The mechanism of those tariffs changes the entire calculus for European manufacturing. I mean, if a German factory faces a 25% premium just to get its steel products onto American soil,
they lose their competitive edge instantly.
Right. But while the U.S. tariffs restrict where Europe can sell, the second catalyst restricts what Europe can actually build, and that is the China factor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Because China essentially holds a complete chokehold on the raw materials required for the 21st century economy.
The numbers from the data are just remarkable. China controls 90% of the refining capacity for rare earth elements.
90%.
Yep. And about 70% of the physical mining. And these aren't just obscure scientific materials. You cannot build a modern wind turbine, a high-tech defense guidance system, or an EV battery without these specific industrial magnets and refined metals.
Wait, so it's not just about who has the rocks in the ground?
No, not at all. Refining rare earths is a technically complex, chemically toxic, and incredibly expensive process. You'd have to separate 17 elements that are chemically almost identical.
That sounds like a nightmare.
It is. Yeah. China spent 30 years building the infrastructure and absorbing the environmental cost to process these materials at a massive scale. Europe outsourced that dirty work to keep their own prices low and their environment clean.
And now they are completely dependent on Chinese refineries. It reminds me of an investor who takes their entire 401k retirement fund and dumps it into just two stocks.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. And now one of those stocks, the United States, has become highly volatile and unpredictable.
Yep.
And the other stock, China, essentially holds the administrative passwords to the account and could freeze the assets at a moment's notice. If you are the European Union, your foundational trade strategy was basically a recipe for catastrophic failure.
It is a profound sovereign risk. When one supplier can shut down your automotive, defense, and green energy sectors just by halting exports, you don't have an economy. You have a hostage situation.
But wait, so is Europe just taking their money and going home? Are they cutting off the US and China entirely?
No, not at all. The EU isn't abandoning the US or China. In fact, 2025 EU exports to the US hit an absolute record of 555 billion euros.
Oh, wow. Okay, so they're still doing massive business.
Huge business. They are managing the risk by aggressively diversifying. They are shifting from finding the cheapest supplier to building a supply chain that physically cannot be stopped by a single geopolitical shock.
And the way they're executing this is fascinating. According to recent analysis, they are using massive trade agreements as like a blunt instrument of industrial policy.
Right. In the past, a free trade agreement was mostly about lowering tariffs on agricultural products or consumer goods.
Mhm.
Today, the EU is negotiating for sheer industrial survival.
We can see this redrawn map taking shape right now. Take the Mercosur deal with the South American trade bloc. This was a negotiation that dragged on for what, 25 years?
Yeah, quarter of a century. But suddenly, with this new urgency, they finally signed it, with provisional applications starting May 1st, 2026.
And then you have India. The EU wrapped up negotiations there in January 2026.
And that deal isn't just about selling European cars to Indian drivers. It is specifically designed to create a massive digital and manufacturing bypass around China.
Oh, I see. So India offers the tech talent and alternative assembly hubs, so European companies aren't entirely reliant on Shenzhen.
Exactly. We also saw the deals finalized with Indonesia in late 2025. Indonesia has massive reserves of nickel.
Which is the irreplaceable core component for the electric vehicle batteries Europe is mandating by law.
Right. But the most revealing move was on March 24th, 2026, when the EU signed an 8-year deal with Australia. It drops 99% of tariffs, but the real prize of the agreement is securing direct access to Australian critical minerals.
Right, because Australia mines the raw lithium and rare earths. And now Europe is setting up the supply lines to eventually process those materials, completely cutting out the Chinese refining monopoly.
Exactly, they're rebuilding the entire pipeline.
Think about a local restaurant in your neighborhood. For years, they bought every single ingredient from one giant mega store across town. It was cheap, and the profit margins were great.
But then the megastore gets unpredictable.
Right. The mega store started randomly raising prices, and a couple of times the delivery truck just didn't show up. So the restaurant owner completely changed the business model. They sign a contract with a local baker, a nearby butcher, and a regional farm.
It takes way more paperwork, and the ingredients cost a little bit more.
Exactly. But if a massive blizzard hits the other side of town and shuts down that mega store, the restaurant's doors stay open. They can still serve food.
That premium, the extra cost and paperwork, is exactly what Europe is suddenly willing to pay to guarantee their economic resilience.
So what does this mean for someone trying to invest in this space?
Well, it completely flips the traditional script. If you were looking at the traditional heavyweights, say the legacy German automotive sector or the older chemical manufacturing plants, you're looking at industries severely burdened by this transition.
Because they're facing U.S. tariffs on one side and Chinese EV competition on the other.
Exactly. The real opportunity requires looking at who is actually building this new resilient network. We are talking about European defense contractors securing these new supply lines, the companies upgrading the continent's power grid infrastructure, and industrial automation firms.
Well, that makes sense. Because when you move supply chains away from cheap labor hubs, you have to replace that labor with advanced robotics and automated facilities in allied nations.
Right. Those are the specific sectors capturing the capital in this transition.
But all of this restructuring brings up a fundamental physical constraint. Europe can secure all the nickel from Indonesia and all the lithium from Australia that it wants. They can build automated factories and new defense systems.
But absolutely none of it works without a massive, continuous, and reliable source of electricity.
Exactly. And as we enter an era dominated by heavy manufacturing and artificial intelligence, the sheer volume of power required is staggering. Which brings us perfectly to the crisis currently unfolding in Japan.
Right. If Europe's primary vulnerability was raw materials, Japan's ultimate reality check is the electricity itself.
Because Japan is an island nation with virtually zero domestic fossil fuels. They import roughly 95% of their oil and 11% of their liquefied natural gas, or LNG, directly from the Middle East.
And almost all of those energy imports have to float on ships through a very narrow, highly volatile maritime choke point called the Strait of Hormuz.
And we saw the vulnerability of this setup clearly when war broke out in March 2026 and effectively blocked the strait.
The impact on Japan's power grid was instantaneous. LNG ships could not get through. Japan was forced to immediately tap into their strategic
The
reserves.
government even had to loosen environmental regulations to fire up older, highly polluting coal plants just to prevent rolling blackouts in Tokyo.
Yeah, it was a desperate situation.
Let's put that in perspective for you. Imagine spending a fortune upgrading your house. You install the latest smart technology, massive air conditioning units, a server rack in the basement, and 3 electric vehicles in the driveway.
Sounds like a great setup.
It is a technological marvel, but you walk outside and realize your entire house is powered by a single fraying extension cord plugged into a neighbor's outlet 3 blocks away.
And if anyone trips on that cord, like a conflict in the Middle East, your whole high-tech life shuts down instantly.
That is precisely what happened. The blocked Strait of Hormuz tripped the extension cord.
But as severe as that shock was, the data shows it was actually just a catalyst accelerating a much larger structural crisis.
What do you mean?
The real pressure forcing Japan to redesign its energy grid isn't just about surviving supply chain shocks from the Middle East. It is about powering the future, specifically the artificial intelligence revolution.
Oh, right. Because of the massive build-out of new AI data centers, combined with Japan's aggressive push to bring semiconductor manufacturing facilities back to domestic soil.
Exactly. Because of all that, Japan's overall power demand is projected to spike by 6% over the next decade.
And we have to understand the specific type of power AI requires. Training a large language model doesn't just use a lot of electricity. It requires continuous, uninterrupted power to run and cool thousands of GPUs simultaneously.
You cannot have a voltage drop, and you cannot have the power cut out when the wind stops blowing. You need what is called baseload power.
Meaning electricity that is always on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Exactly.
But looking at this from the outside, the obvious question is, why nuclear? Look at the data. This is Japan. The trauma that the 2011 Fukushima disaster inflicted on Japan was profound. It reshaped their entire culture, their politics, and their relationship with energy.
Absolutely.
So if they desperately need power for these new AI data centers, why not just go all in on wind and solar? Why risk nuclear?
It is the most heavily debated question in Japanese politics.
That.
But the reality comes down to the unforgiving physics of their geography.
How so?
Japan is highly mountainous, which severely limits the flat land necessary for massive utility-scale solar farms.
Yeah.
Their coastal waters get very deep very quickly, making offshore wind farms incredibly expensive and difficult to anchor.
Ah, I see.
Renewables are expanding, and they are important, but they simply cannot generate the uninterrupted baseload power required by a heavy industrial and AI-driven economy.
So the math simply doesn't work out without nuclear.
Exactly. It is no longer a political debate of renewables versus nuclear. To survive the AI data center boom, Japan requires maximum output from both. And the government has officially recognized this.
Right. In February 2025, they released the 7th Energy Basic Plan.
Which is a monumental shift in policy. They officially stripped out all the legacy language about reducing their dependence on nuclear power.
And instead, they set a hard, codified target achieving a 20% nuclear mix by the year 2040.
They essentially redefined nuclear power from being a national liability to being the critical backbone of their modern infrastructure.
And Prime Minister Takaichi's government is moving incredibly fast to execute this. It has become a massive, state-backed industrial policy.
We saw a major milestone in February 2026 with the symbolic restart of the Kashiwazaki Kariwa Unit 6,
Right.
which is part of the largest nuclear plant in the world.
And the details of that restart are actually very telling, aren't they?
Very telling. While they got the reactor turned back on, commercial operations were delayed because engineers discovered a very minor electrical leak during the testing phase.
And they immediately paused everything.
Right. And for investors and the public, that delay is actually a highly positive signal. It demonstrates that while the political will to restart these plants is moving rapidly, the technical oversight remains incredibly rigorous.
They are proving that a post-Fukushima regulatory framework can function safely without cutting corners.
Exactly.
But Japan isn't just repairing their legacy reactors. They are looking outward to secure the next generation of nuclear technology, and they're doing it in direct partnership with the United States.
Yep. According to recent analysis, on March 19, 2026, the U.S. and Japan announced an unprecedented $73 billion energy cooperation project.
$73 billion. The scale of that capital commitment is staggering, and it shows the depth of this new alliance.
And when you look at where that money is going, $40 billion of it is dedicated to a GE Vernova Hitachi small modular reactor project, often called SMRs, located in the United States, specifically in Tennessee and Alabama.
Plus, there are major new partnerships forming with Westinghouse.
Right.
Japan isn't just taking out a checkbook and buying American nuclear technology off the shelf. They are acting exactly like a co-founder in a massive energy startup.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, they're combining Japanese capital, their legendary heavy manufacturing capabilities, and their engineering precision to physically build this new nuclear supply chain alongside the U.S.
And the focus on small modular reactors is key here. Unlike the massive bespoke legacy reactors that take a decade and billions of dollars to construct on-site, SMRs are designed to be manufactured in pieces on a factory floor, shipped to a location, and assembled.
Oh, wow. So it's much more efficient.
Much more. They also utilize passive, safety cooling systems that don't rely on external power grids, addressing the exact vulnerability that caused the Fukushima meltdown.
So by partnering with the U.S., Japan is embedding its own manufacturing base deeply into the global supply chain for this next-generation technology.
Exactly.
So if you are an investor watching this massive pivot, the obvious targets might be the traditional utility companies that sell electricity to Japanese consumers, but that seems like entirely the wrong play.
It is. The utilities are highly regulated and burdened with legacy debt. The real structural boom here is a massive state-funded capital expenditure cycle. You want to look at the picks and shovels of this nuclear renaissance.
Meaning the companies that are physically doing the heavy lifting?
Right. The firms handling the specialized maintenance, the advanced safety upgrades, the massive turbine manufacturing, and the digital control systems required to run these plants safely.
Like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. That's a perfect example from the recent data.
It really is. They are projecting record sales in their nuclear division and are expanding their specialized reactor workforce by 10%.
And when an industrial giant starts hiring hundreds of highly specialized nuclear engineers, that is the ultimate leading indicator of a multi-decade boom.
You are looking at a guaranteed pipeline of state-backed contracts for the companies capable of building and maintaining this infrastructure.
Let's pull all of this together. We've covered a massive amount of ground today, from the ports of Australia to the nuclear control rooms of Japan.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But the underlying thread here is that the era of frictionless, perfectly optimized, borderless globalization is over. We are now operating in an era defined by unpredictable tariff walls, geopolitical chokeholds on essential raw materials, and an unprecedented, insatiable demand for electricity driven by artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and economies that want to survive, like the European Union and Japan, are tearing up their old strategies. They recognize that remaining competitive tomorrow requires building heavily protected, resilient supply chains and securing absolute control over their own baseload power today.
It is a complete rewiring of how global wealth is generated and protected.
It really is. But, this shift leaves us with a profound lingering question.
What's that?
Well, if massive economic blocs like the EU and Japan are aggressively forming these exclusive, tight-knit regional supply chains and highly protected energy alliances, what happens to the legacy institutions that govern the old world? Organizations like the World Trade Organization were designed to facilitate a unified, borderless global market. If the major players are prioritizing security over efficiency, are we witnessing the permanent collapse of globalism?
Wow.
Are we watching the birth of a new fortress economy era where you are either safely inside the walls with your strategic allies or you are left entirely out in the cold?
That is a fascinating and honestly slightly chilling concept to think about. As these economic walls continue to rise, it is going to completely redefine how we evaluate risk and opportunity in every portfolio. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button.